So you might be somebody who have dabbled with self-help or even therapy in the past, and nobody was able really to put their finger on exactly what the issue was, and therefore you feel like you never got to the crux of it and it didn't get solved, and there might be some residual effects from whatever that presenting issue was. There are multiple times where you have a presenting issue that are not even textbook and diagnosed in a formal way, don't fit into any one category. So what happens with those cases? Well, a good part of them falls under something that here in Aspire we've been working and researching for years and years. And we're going to talk about that today in today's podcast. We're going to be talking about the logic emotion ratio and restoring the necessary equilibrium. My name is Daniel Ifra, LCSW, here on the Sainstorming Show, where we sainstorm ways, not brainstorm, but sainstorm ways to keep each other sane in a complex world. So today we're talking about this fundamental logic, emotional timeline equilibrium scale. And, I want to tell you something for being a therapist in the field for over 15 years, I can't tell you how I'm repeatedly surprised about how crucial this piece is in mental health and how little talk and discussion there is, even amongst the professionals, even in the literature for that matter, about the logical emotional ratio. And I want to tell you a little bit more about it today, what it is, what it does, and what happens when it's out of whack. And that's something that we here at Aspire, we've been doing and researching for many years, because I'm seeing it more and more and more in my practice. I'm seeing it beyond that, based on the case studies that I'm reading and the emails that I'm getting coming from all over. And it's something that deserves not one podcast, but several. And it's really the backbone of a lot of stuff that we've been talking about and that we do and that we will continue to talk about over time. But just to lay it out in a more simplistic sense, to give you an overview, I want you to imagine we have this scale. You have a scale 1 to 10. So we're going to have this scale. And on one side is the half of the brain, which is, we'll call logic, and the other half of the brain, which is called emotion. Okay? And they're each polar opposite sides of the spectrum. They work very differently. They process things differently. Their functions are extremely unique and differ from each other tremendously. And where we want to be as humans is relatively somewhere in the middle of that logic and that emotion, which means it's not going to always be exactly in the middle, but different situations are going to be pulled back and forth between this emotional and logical force, so to speak. And different situations will have an outcome, some a little bit more emotional, some a little bit more logical, but there's this constant pull, magnetic pull from each of them against each other that actually keeps the suspension and keeps us where we need to be. So you have like these two opposing forces on each side of the equilibrium. You have these two opposing forces. You have these two opposing forces on each side of the scale, and they're each of them are actively working against one another, because what logic will tell you is to respond is not necessarily what emotion is going to tell you to respond, and vice versa. Yet that pull of opposites is what keeps us in check and keeps our responses grounded and human. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But let's now break down, just so you understand what we mean by logic and emotion. When we talk about logic, we talk about things that are very, very, logic tends to be a lot more concrete, black and white, not usually based on public opinion. Logic is something that's more equational, something that we have either learned growing up, or we know it to be as true as fact from studies, and we take that principle and we apply it to the situation at hand, and that would be what we would call logic. Very little abstract emotional thinking involved there. Emotion is something that's requires a lot more conceptual, abstract kind of thinking, imagination, and it's something that's much harder to pinpoint. The emotions are intertwined with feelings. So what you'll have coming out of the emotions, the emotional side of the ratio, is some empathy sometimes for others, feelings, right? Being able to identify those feelings that a person has, being able to pick up on the feelings of others, and frankly, flexibility, right? Logic doesn't give you a whole lot of room for flexibility, because logic is, this is the way it needs to be. 1 + 1 = 2. So the flexibility, usually, at least, exceptions for certain situations, and it's sort of like marking things with a curve, that's going to go under your emotional part of your brain. And very often, when things are not in check, it's because there's too much of a gap between the balance and that ratio of emotional or logical. You can sometimes see where you'll have an individual, again, we're all roughly should be somewhere balanced in the middle. And for a person who's a lot more towards the logical side of the spectrum, right, the emotional side is not as strong. Or somebody who's a lot closer to the emotional side of the spectrum and not really well grounded logically, you see the gap is going to be much wider for that person, because they're not grounded in the middle. They're not balanced. When that happens, I can't even tell you the amount of fallout that can result from that lack of balance. And what's interesting is when you restore it and you work to restore that balance, things do slowly start to fall back into place. Because as humans, having that balance is what makes us different than AI, for example. AI does not have that balance. We have that balance, and our basically our whole quest in life is to be able to take our different situations and balance the emotion and the logic together, and have our responses and our ideas and our pursuits reflecting that balance. And when that's where it needs to be, it's a different ballgame. But for various reasons, you'll have people that are gravitating either towards the logic too much, or gravitating towards the emotion too much, and that's where the havoc is wreaked. So that's for every individual. I want to take a moment to talk about how this presents itself in kids, because I'm we have often times where we'll have children that will come in for an evaluation. And again, there's not necessarily a single category that really explains the difficulties that they're going through. Sometimes it's academic, sometimes it's social, whatever it may be. And sometimes I'm pretty clear that the issue is that there's too large of a gap between their emotion for their developmental stage, that is, right? Kids, let's talk about an 8-year-old. An 8-year-old should have a certain element of logic, but should also have a certain element of emotions for an 8-year-old, right? And that those emotions may be very raw. Those emotions may be volatile. He may not be able to gravitate and balance things properly. But for the developmental norm for an 8-year-old would be not necessarily to be in the middle. It might be a little bit more towards the emotion. Imagine you have an 8-year-old, right, that uses a lot of logic, too much logic. Maybe you see this a lot with kids that are off the chart with their IQs. They're cognitively extremely advanced. But then what happens is you're going to notice that very often, more often than not, when they're cognitively extremely advanced, emotionally in their responses, you're going to see a certain immaturity for their age. So again, you have that gap. You have this wide gap. You have the cognition up here. You have the emotions down here. So you have that wide gap there, and that in itself is what wreaks havoc. And you can have it the other way as well. You can have sometimes somebody who's, let's say, 10, and their emotions need to be on par with their logic, but yet the logic is the average of a 10-year-old, but the emotions is the emotions of a 5-year-old. You have a wide gap as well. And now how they got there, that's a whole other talk. That's a whole other discussion. And there could be different reasons how they got there. But the fact remains that for nothing else, but when that ratio is knocked off balance, there can be a whole host of issues that result from that. So again, this is a super important topic, not that much discussed about it, to be quite honest with you. You can do your own research. It's not really out there. We are the pioneers of this kind of stuff. And I think as you listen to our show more and more, you're going to see how central this logic and emotion ratio is. So here we are. We're throwing out all this information. We're saying how crucial it is that there is this proper balance, and yet when there is this gap in the balance and things are off kilter, things can go haywire. So what do we do about it? Well, that's sort of like the $1 million question. But the response to that is there is what to do about it. There is what to do about it. And we have to sort of remember and go back to old school medicine. Why do I say old school medicine? Well, let's talk about this. One of the most famous things, I think, that I love this example, and this has been around forever, with all the advances in ophthalmology, right? We know that there's a concept called a lazy eye. Lazy eye basically is one eye muscle is weaker than the other. So when you have one eye muscle that's weaker than the other, what do they do in order to treat that lazy eye? Well, what they do is pretty simple. They cover the strong eye, because by covering the strong eye, you're basically forcing the lazy eye to do more work. And the more the lazy eye will do more work, the less lazy it becomes by default, because it has no choice. So with time, you start wearing the patch on the strong eye less often and less often, because that balance between the two, the right eye and the left eye, become more parallel and become more on par. The logic emotion ratio is not different in principle than that. What we need to do is actually increase manually the weaker muscle, whether it be emotion, whether it be logic. And we have ways of doing that, and every situation is very unique, and it's kind of that part is a little bit more of a complex talk. But for our purposes, reinstituting and re-strengthening and flexing the muscles of the weaker muscle, so to speak, is how we will restore that logic and emotion ratio, which can, again, resolve so many issues in of themselves. So I think you're going to hear a lot more about this from us, but this is really, really important stuff. And I think if you take a minute and a step back and you think about different people you know, or people in your own life, or people in your own family, and you look through this lens of the logic and emotion ratio, I think it's going to be a whole new world, because I know it was for myself. And I'm the professional who's been working in this field. Let's just recap and wrap this up. We're introducing a concept that fills in the gaps of a lot of places where the mental health industry seems to fall short, because a lot of things do not fall within the categories and diagnoses that they offer. And that's all we can talk about. That's a whole other piece. And I'm not saying every single time, but a lot of the times you have this is an important template. This is a crucial dynamic scale to keep in mind whenever we're dealing with a mental health issue, is the logic versus the emotional ratio. And it's really at the heart of what makes us all tick. And I think it's overlooked. And the good news is that there's what to do about it. Once you identify it, we definitely have ways of, like I said, with that lazy eye, bringing them up to par. And when you do that, a lot of the things will fall into place. So today was super fundamental talk today about this logic and emotional ratio. The research is ongoing. The research is ongoing here in Aspire, and we, like I said, we're the cutting edge on this kind of work. We've been doing it for years and coming up with all different techniques of how to treat it successfully. So that's today's talk. Hope to see you guys again really soon. And on that note, have a good one. Thanks for being here.